My name is Carolyn Fiddler. I'm Communications Director at Daily Kos and also one of the foremost experts in the country on state politics. And when it comes to state politics, it really doesn't get much more important than secretaries of state and the work that they do. But that's never been more true than this cycle. What with democracy, small d, under existential threat, our secretaries of state in various states have helped safeguard us from the nonsense that Republicans have been working to foist on us in the age of Trump and post-Trump as well. But today, I am joined by some amazing Democratic secretaries of state, including Jenna Griswold of Colorado, Denise Merrill of Connecticut, Shenna Bellows of Maine, and Jocelyn Benson of Michigan, all very important states in terms of defending democracy in this day and age. So I'm going to let all of them introduce themselves because you want to hear from them. I would love for Secretary Bellows to introduce herself.
Hello, Netroots. I'm so excited to be here with all of you and to share this stage, this virtual stage with some of the democracy champions from 2020. I am one of the newest secretaries of state, although not new to voting rights. Like Secretary Griswold, I grew up with low income, working class roots. I grew up without electricity or running water until I was in the 5th grade in Maine. But due to good public education and lots of support along the way, I went to work at the National ACLU as a national field organizer. That's where I got my start on voting rights, working on the Voting Rights Act reauthorization between 2003 and 2005, before moving back home to Maine to be executive director at the ACLU of Maine. In that capacity, I've seen what happens when Republicans take control of legislatures. In our state, we've had same-day voter registration since 1973. When Republicans took control of the legislature and the governorship, they eliminated it. I led a statewide referendum campaign to win it back at the ballot box, and we succeeded. I went on to serve in the state Senate, where I chaired the Labor Committee, and am now Maine's first female Secretary of State. And again, it's so wonderful to be here with all.
Bellows, would love to hear about your thoughts on the biggest threats facing our democracy at this point in time.
Well, what Secretary Griswold just said and named is something that was unimaginable 2 years ago or 10 years ago, and that is election sabotage. It is a crystal clear example of what's happening all across the country. So we need to organize to make sure we have better leaders in positions of power to fight back against that. Secretary Benson talked about voter suppression, and that's something that when we started our careers at the ACLU and Southern Poverty Law Center, fighting back about systematic, structural voter oppression, targeting specifically Black and brown voters. It's rooted in white supremacy. That is something we have to continue to do work on. And Secretary Merrill talked about the For the People Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. We must have federal standards all across the country. And then finally, just to echo my colleagues, this is rooted in a deliberate and organized campaign to discourage people from participating in our democracy. It is an attack on our very democracy itself, because when everyone participates, everything that we care about, social justice, climate justice, economic justice, we win. Those on the other side are trying to discourage people from participating. That's what this really is about. We have to fight back to protect our democracy, to protect everything.
Secretary Bellows, I would love to hear from you on this. And I think it's worth pointing out also that the nature of your how you came to your office is a little different than everyone else on this call. And I think that's worth noting as well, just for folks' information. And maybe I'm just the only nerd who cares about this.
So in Maine, the Secretary of State is elected by the legislature rather than popular vote. So who controls the legislature matters. And when I was first elected to the state Senate, I won a district, I replaced a Republican, I won a district that voted for Trump, and I served in the minority in the Senate. And I brought a bill to put into place automatic voter registration, and it fell on deaf ears. And so it took a Democratic majority in the legislature before we could pass automatic voter registration. And now as secretary, I have the privilege of getting to implement that. We do have a Democratic controlled legislature at this point in time. So this year, as Secretary of State, I partnered with the legislature and our governor, Janet Mills, to move forward online voter registration, ongoing absentee voting for seniors and people with disabilities, We made student IDs at Maine colleges and universities a form of identification and residency for voter registration purposes. And we made permanent absentee ballot drop boxes so that more than 80% of Mainers will have access to an absentee ballot drop box, while states like Georgia and Florida were taking theirs down. So those are things that we did from a policy perspective. But I am running a referendum election right now in 2021, and it has given me an inside view as to the power that a Secretary of State has that is not contingent on the legislature or the governor. So for example, I approve voting polling place location changes, and that can have huge consequences for who participates. Overseeing procedures for voting at nursing homes and residential care facilities, again, serious consequences. And so those are the decisions that Secretaries of State make every day. And I think it's really important for organizers to recognize that these positions are incredibly crucial to the health of our democracy.
And speaking of the world we're living in right now, Secretary Bellows, you happen to be sort of the newest kid on the block, so to speak, since you became secretary in the aftermath of the 2020 elections. I believe I have that correct. So I would love to hear about what you were doing, seeing what you saw, knowing what we now know to prepare for 2022.
I ran for Secretary of State to protect our democracy because I saw what was happening around the country in 2020, and I was deeply, deeply alarmed. I was sworn into office on January 4th, excited to be Maine's first female Secretary of State. Behind me is a portrait of the first female member of Congress, Jeanette Rankin, and that symbolism was really important to me. And then January 6th happened. And January 6th is a day that we can never forget, and we need to recognize that it is a blueprint for what could potentially be happening in 2024. We need to prepare for the worst. And to hear Jocelyn talking so bravely about the threats to herself and her family, but to say what is most important is the threat to the democracy, that is such a brave thing to say, and it's such an important thing to say. So as I did a listening tour around the state, I started to hear from my local election officials that a few of them too had encountered threats, physical threats to their safety. And this is, and shouldn't be, this is not partisan. Election administration, our democracy, has always been a nonpartisan or bipartisan endeavor. And those who would threaten that democracy, those who would do violence on our democracy, they are trying to attack our very structures, the freedoms that we as organizers have worked over 2 centuries to build. And so it was a sobering thing to come in thinking I was going to be working on policy and having a policy agenda to move forward, which we did, to expand voter participation in our state. Even though we were number 3 in 2020, we'd like to be Colorado and Minnesota someday. But then to realize that we had to work on the safety of our election officials, that we had to think about election subversion and what that means and how we fight back against that.